Picture this. It's dawn in Rouen, May 30th, 1431. The air smells of smoke and rain. A crowd gathers around a wooden platform piled high with straw, pitch, and bundles of kindling. Church bells echo through the fog, not to call for prayer, but to summon witnesses. Today, a 19-year-old girl will burn, not as a murderer, not as a witch, but as a symbol too dangerous to let live. Her name is Jeanne d'Arc, Joan of Arc, and for the Church, she is both a heretic and a reminder of everything they failed to control. They say the fire was ready hours before she arrived. They wanted it to burn clean, to leave no bone, no relic, no trace. Because relics can become miracles, and miracles can become rebellion. But before the flames, before the betrayal, there was a girl who said she heard voices. The year is 1425. The 100 Years' War has dragged on for nearly a century between England and France. Villages burn, plague spreads, kings die, and crowns pass to children. In a small village called Domremy, a peasant girl tends her father's sheep and watches soldiers pass like ghosts across the fields. Her name is Jeanne. She cannot read or write, but she believes. She says that one day, while working in her father's garden, a light appeared, brighter than the sun, and with it, a voice. It called itself Saint Michael. He told her she had been chosen, that God had a plan, that she would lead France to victory. At 13, she didn't understand what it meant. By 16, she was ready to die for it. France at that time was fractured, half controlled by the English, half by their French allies, the Burgundians. The rightful heir, Charles VII, was hiding in the Loire Valley, uncertain, defeated, surrounded by courtiers who whispered that his bloodline might be illegitimate. And then came Joan. She rode for 11 days through enemy territory to reach his court in Chinon, wearing men's clothes to disguise herself. When she stood before the Dauphin, she claimed she could recognize him even without his crown, and did. The courtiers froze. How could a farm girl know? They tested her, questioned her. Priests examined her virginity, nobles laughed at her armor, and generals doubted her visions. But she would not bend. "I am not afraid," she told them, "for God is with me." In April 1429, Charles gave her command, not in name, but in truth. She led thousands of men to Orléans, a city besieged by the English for months. Her banner was white, embroidered with lilies and the words, Jesus Maria. When the gates opened at dawn, she rode first. The soldiers who fought beside her said it was like watching faith itself take shape. She never carried a sword in battle, only her banner, yet men followed her into impossible fights. Within a week, the English were retreating. Within 2 months, Charles was crowned king in Reims Cathedral, with Joan standing beside him in armor that glinted like polished bone. But triumph is never safe in the eyes of power. The same men who once knelt before her began to whisper. The church grew uneasy, a woman in armor, hearing voices, leading armies. It was an affront to every doctrine written by men. And worse, she had done what no priest or noble could. She gave France hope. Hope is dangerous. Hope spreads faster than heresy. By May 1430, the English had regrouped. Joan was captured outside Compiègne by Burgundian soldiers and sold to the English for 10,000 livres, the price of a nobleman's ransom. Charles VII, the king she had crowned, did nothing. He had his throne now. He didn't need his saint. In Rouen, she was handed to the Inquisition under Bishop Pierre Cauchon, a man who owed his position to English gold. He didn't want the truth. He wanted confession. For months, they interrogated her in Latin, a language she didn't understand. They twisted her words, mocked her visions, and accused her of witchcraft, heresy, and blasphemy. She stood alone, surrounded by 37 judges, no lawyer, no allies. When they demanded she deny her voices, she said quietly, "How else would God speak to me if not through angels?" When they told her that wearing men's clothes was a sin, she answered, "I wear them because it pleases God and keeps me safe among men." Every word she spoke dug her grave deeper. By May 29, 1431, the verdict was ready. She was guilty, not of killing, not of treason, but of defying the silence expected of women. They sentenced her to burn at the stake the next morning. Witnesses said that when they brought her out into the square, she looked up at the Tower of Saint-Ouen and whispered a prayer for the men who condemned her. Then she asked for a cross. A soldier broke a stick in two and tied it together with rope. She kissed it. At 9 a.m., the fire was lit. By 9:30, there was nothing left but ash. But the story, her story, was only beginning. When the flames died that morning in Rouen, the silence was unbearable. Smoke still rose from the scaffold, curling like black ribbons into the gray sky. The executioner stood pale, trembling, and later confessed to the priests, "I fear I have burned a saint." But the Inquisition called it justice. They had written every question, every accusation, every lie into a manuscript, hundreds of pages of Latin testimony. Their goal was not truth, but justification. The church needed to prove that this 19-year-old girl, who had once led an army, had been nothing more than a witch dressed in armor. And yet, every word they wrote only made her stronger. Let's rewind. The Inquisition wasn't born in France. It came from 13th century Spain, created to protect faith by destroying heresy. It began as a whispering network of priests and informants, but it grew into a machine, one that fed on fear. By the time Joan stood before her judges, the Inquisition had already burned thousands, but never someone like her, never someone the people loved. Rouen, February 1431. Joan was locked in a stone cell in the castle keep. Iron chains bound her to a wooden beam. The guards were English soldiers, men who hated her, because she had humiliated them on the battlefield. They taunted her at night, calling her witch, whore, devil's bride. She asked for a woman to guard her. They refused. They wanted her to break, not just in body, but in faith. Each day, a procession of theologians entered her cell. They spoke of obedience, of submission, of the natural order where women should be silent. They told her that her voices were demons in disguise. She answered calmly, "If they hate me for loving God, then their hatred is proof enough that He speaks to me." Her composure terrified them. On March 10th, they began the public interrogations. The courtroom wasn't a courtroom at all, just a dim hall filled with men in robes, quills scratching, candles flickering. They questioned her for 6 hours a day. Did the voices tell you to dress as a man? Do you believe you are in God's grace? Do you think the saints prefer France over England? That last question was a trap. If she said yes, she'd be guilty of blasphemy, claiming God chose sides. If she said no, she'd betray everything she fought for. Joan smiled faintly. "If I am not in His grace, may God put me there. And if I am, may He keep me there." It was the perfect answer. Even her judges knew it. But victory in words meant nothing. The verdict was already written. By April, they had one last plan: forced confession. They threatened her with torture: the rack, the wheel, the Iron Maiden. They led her into a chamber lined with instruments of pain, glowing red in the torchlight. "Confess," said Bishop Cochon. "Sign the paper, and you will be spared." Joan looked at the table. The parchment was covered in Latin. She couldn't read it, but she saw her name scrawled at the bottom in a hand that wasn't hers, ready for her trembling mark. Outside the door, she could hear the hammering of carpenters building the pyre. She refused. They tied her arms, pressed the spikes, but she never screamed. Then something changed. On May 24th, after months of isolation, she broke, for one moment. Terrified of the fire, she signed a statement she couldn't read. The church called it abjuration, repentance. They declared her reconciled. The next morning, they dressed her in women's clothes and placed her in a cell with English guards. They laughed as they touched her, cut her hair, tore her gown. To protect herself, she begged again for armor, men's clothes, the only defense she had. The moment she put them on, the Inquisition rejoiced. She had relapsed. The sentence was automatic: death by fire. On May 30th, 1431, they led her through the market square. No priest would hold the cross for her, so she asked one of the guards. "Please," she said, "raise it high so I can see it through the smoke." As the flames climbed, she cried out once, "Jesus!" And then the fire drowned her voice. The witnesses said the wind turned suddenly, blowing the smoke away from her face, as if the heavens themselves refused to hide what man had done. When the ashes cooled, the executioner gathered the charred bones and scattered them in the Seine. But the river carried them downstream, to the fields of France she once saved. In 1456, 25 years later, a retrial was ordered by Pope Calixtus III. Every priest who had condemned her was summoned to testify. The records were reread aloud, and for the first time, the church admitted its sin. Joan was declared innocent. Her judges were condemned, but she was already gone. They called her the Maid of Orleans. To France, she became a legend. To the church, a lesson. And to history, a question that still burns. Was she a saint? Or just a girl who refused to bow? The fire that consumed Joan of Arc didn't end with her. It spread slowly, invisibly, through the veins of Europe. By the time her ashes had cooled in the River Seine, the Inquisition had discovered something far more powerful than heresy. They had discovered fear. Fear could silence armies. Fear could control kings. And fear, especially of women, could sanctify any cruelty. In the decades that followed Joan's death, the church learned to refine its rituals of purification. The same words shouted over her pyre, heretic, relapsed, idolater, would echo through towns from Spain to the Alps, from the Rhineland to the Scottish moors. But this time, it was not a girl in armor they hunted. It was the women who healed, who brewed, who knew too much about life and too little about obedience. The Inquisition, originally meant to protect the purity of faith, had become an empire of suspicion. Its reach expanded with terrifying precision. By the 1480s, in the hands of men like Tomás de Torquemada in Spain, it evolved into something monstrous, a legal machine built not for truth, but for confession. Confession at any cost. Torture rooms were renamed chambers of faith. The rack became the question, and if a woman screamed her innocence too long, the church simply said that the devil had hardened her heart. The logic was perfect, unbreakable, and deadly. The idea of the witch, as we know it, was born in these rooms. Before the 15th century, witchcraft had been seen as superstition, a petty sin of the ignorant. But in 1486, two Dominican inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger published a book that would change the world. Malleus Maleficarum. The Hammer of Witches. It claimed that all witchcraft stemmed from the lust of women, that women were weaker in faith, more carnal by nature, and therefore more easily seduced by Satan. And suddenly, the war against heresy became a war against womanhood itself. Between 1450 and 1750, historians estimate that more than 60,000 people were executed for witchcraft in Europe, 80% of them women. But these numbers are more than statistics. They were names, faces, lives erased from records and rewritten as sins. In Germany, entire villages were emptied. In Scotland, mothers and daughters were burned together. In Switzerland, inquisitors were paid by the number of confessions extracted, a business model of horror. And everywhere, fire became the instrument of purification. Imagine a market square in Bamberg, 1628. The bells ring. The crowd gathers. At the center, a woman stands tied to a stake, her white shift soaked in pitch. She's 50 years old, a midwife, accused by a jealous neighbor after a stillbirth. They say she danced with the devil. They say her hands carried death. They say she confessed after 3 nights without sleep, hanging by her wrists. The judge blesses the flames. Children climb onto rooftops to see better. The first tongues of fire lick her feet, and she begins to pray. Not to God, but for her children, watching from the crowd. When the smoke clears, the priests write another line in their ledger. One more soul purified by fire. By the 17th century, the Inquisition had perfected its spectacle. Executions became theater, moral lessons staged for the faithful. In Spain, the auto da fe, act of faith, was a public celebration. The condemned were paraded through the streets in bright yellow robes covered with painted devils, while nobles watched from balconies. Children cheered, musicians played. And when the torches were lit, a priest raised a silver cross and declared, "God triumphs." But the question no one dared ask was, which God? The witch hunts were not driven by theology alone. They were politics disguised as piety. In the German principalities, inquisitors targeted widows because widows owned property. In France, they targeted healers because they competed with church medicine. In England, under King James the Monarch, witchcraft trials became tools of royal propaganda, reinforcing his image as a defender of faith. And behind it all, the church maintained its silence. The same church that had burned Joan d'Arc now canonized her memory, while condemning women who resembled her. By the mid-1600s, a strange paradox filled Europe. Every village feared witches. Every pulpit preached against them. And yet in secret, people still left bread at the doors of old women. Still whispered prayers to saints who once had been heretics, because deep down, they knew. The line between faith and fear was vanishing. When did the holy fire become hellfire? When did belief turn into control? And why did it always begin and end with a woman standing alone before a crowd? Fear changes people. But when fear is sanctified, when it's dressed in robes and blessed by Scripture, it becomes something far more dangerous. It becomes righteousness. To understand the cruelty of the Inquisition, we must step behind the altar, into the minds of those who built the pyres. The inquisitors didn't see themselves as villains. They believed they were surgeons cutting rot from the body of Christendom. Every confession was a cure, every scream a victory for God. And in their conviction lay the deepest horror. Spain, 1492. The world was shifting. The same year Columbus sailed west, the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella issued the Edict of Expulsion, driving Jews from their lands. The Inquisition, led by Tomás de Torquemada, was at its height. Torquemada wasn't a monster in the way we imagine. He wasn't cruel for pleasure. He was methodical, calculating, a man who saw flames as purifiers. He believed the world was a forge and that he was shaping souls in God's fire. When he signed a death warrant, he prayed first. When he ordered the rack, he whispered a blessing. He told his men, "Pain brings truth faster than reason," and they believed him. The inquisitorial chambers were not chaotic torture dungeons. They were laboratories of faith. Every instrument had a purpose. Every scream had meaning. The strappado, where prisoners were suspended by their wrists until their shoulders dislocated, was said to lift the soul toward heaven. The toca, an early form of waterboarding, was called the baptism of truth. Even starvation was framed as mercy, better hunger than hellfire. The inquisitors didn't see agony, they saw salvation. But what happens when the saviors begin to doubt? Documents from Seville, 1505, describe a young friar named Diego de Landa, who served as an assistant to an inquisitor. In his private journal, later discovered by scholars, he wrote, "We burn them to save them, but each time I smell the smoke, I fear it's my own soul that burns." Doubt was a crime in itself. So Diego buried his guilt in ritual. He fasted, he prayed, he tortured, and slowly, doubt turned into devotion again, not to God, but to the system. The Inquisition survived because it turned fear into order. It trained its followers to see confession not as the truth, but as obedience. And in that obedience lay absolution. If a woman cried out on the rack, it was proof of her guilt. If she stayed silent, it was proof that the devil had sealed her lips. Every outcome confirmed their faith. It was a logic built to destroy reason. To the inquisitors, heretics were not people. They were diseases. The manuals they wrote described heresy in the same tone physicians used for plague. They diagnosed, classified, and eradicated. The church became a hospital of horror, but every cure required a patient, and the easiest patients to accuse were women. Women were perfect targets for the Inquisition's psychology. They were seen as emotional, impressionable, physically weaker, more likely, therefore, to yield to temptation. Priests often described women's confessions in disturbingly intimate language. They called them spiritual seductions. In reality, many inquisitors projected their own desire and fear onto the accused. The witch became an embodiment of everything forbidden: lust, independence, defiance, and destroying her felt like cleansing themselves. Burning a woman was never just about faith, it was about control. There's a record from Toledo, 1510, of an inquisitor named Brother Mateo. He led the interrogation of a young widow, Isabel de Montiel, accused of witchcraft after her husband's mysterious death. The trial transcript still exists. He asks, "Did you lay with the devil?" She replies, "No, Father." He presses, "Did he appear as a man?" She says, "Only in your words." That one sentence sealed her fate. Brother Mateo ordered her burned 3 days later. In his final report, he wrote, "She mocked divine authority and thus revealed her allegiance to Satan." For centuries, historians called this madness, but it wasn't madness. It was systematized faith. Each pyre was a sermon, each victim a reminder that questioning meant damnation. And as the centuries passed, the Inquisitors' tools evolved, but their purpose remained the same: to erase anything that frightened men. Joan of Arc, Isabel de Montiel, hundreds of nameless healers and midwives. They all shared one sin. They stood outside the boundaries men had drawn for them. When the flames rose, the inquisitors watched in silence, not out of cruelty, out of belief, because they had convinced themselves that this smell of burning flesh, this sound of cracking wood, was the sound of faith triumphing over evil. And maybe in some twisted way, they were right. Because fear did triumph for centuries. They say the worst flames are not the ones that burn the body. They are the ones lit by betrayal. Among the countless stories buried in the Inquisition's archives, one name returns again and again, whispered like a curse. Catalina de los Rios, known to her neighbors as La Colorada, the Red One. Her crime wasn't witchcraft, not at first. It was love. Seville, 1533, the city was a furnace of faith and fear. Gold from the New World poured into its ports, while the Inquisition's black robes drifted through its narrow streets like shadows. Catalina was 27. Born to a wealthy merchant, she had inherited both his fortune and his temper. She was clever, educated, fluent in Latin, rare for a woman of her time. Her husband, Don Alvaro, was older, cautious, and devout. To the world, they were a perfect couple, but behind the carved doors of their house, something darker simmered. Alvaro had been ruined in business, and Catalina's inheritance now supported him. He called her pride a sin. She called his silence cowardice. Their love curdled into something that neither could name. Not hatred, but humiliation. And humiliation, in the world of men and faith, was deadly. The Inquisition had spies everywhere, servants, confessors, neighbors. In Seville, one confession could start a chain reaction. A servant, seeking favor, whispered that Catalina kept a locked chest filled with strange powders and herbs. Another claimed she stayed awake by candlelight, reading books in languages no priest could read. The story grew with each retelling, as stories of women always did. They said she spoke to spirits. They said she healed a dying child by laying her hands upon him. They said her hair glowed red because it had been kissed by the devil. When Alvaro was summoned by the tribunal to testify, he hesitated. If he defended her, suspicion might fall on him. If he stayed silent, she would hang alone. He chose silence. March 1534, Catalina was arrested at dawn. Soldiers tore through her home, seizing books, candles, even her wedding ring. In the chamber of inquiry, she faced Father Rodrigo de Salazar, a man whose reputation was built on extracting confession without blood, a master of words sharper than any blade. He began softly, "My daughter, you have been misled. The devil is cunning, especially with women who believe themselves wise. Repent, and God will forgive you." She met his eyes. "It is not the devil who teaches me to read." The room went still. For weeks they questioned her. Every herbal remedy became an act of sorcery. Every book, a demonic pact. Every wound from her husband, a mark of the beast. When they asked her to name her accomplices, she spoke only one name, Alvaro. Not to accuse him, but to remind them that love had once existed. He was called to testify again. This time, he did not stay silent. He swore that his wife had fallen from grace, that she kept unnatural company and mocked confession. His words sealed her fate. Later that night, in her cell, Catalina carved a cross into the wall with her fingernails. Beneath it, she etched a single line in Latin. Amor me fecit. Love made me do it. Her execution was held on April 2nd, 1534, in the Plaza de San Francisco. Witnesses said the sky was clear and the wind blew east. Good for burning. She walked barefoot, head high, her red hair loose, her white gown stained with soot. Alvaro watched from the crowd, trembling. Some said he wept, others said he prayed. When they tied her to the stake, Father Rodrigo approached with a crucifix. He whispered, "Repent, and your soul will be saved." Catalina looked up and answered, "Tell your God I am already with him." The fire was lit. She did not scream. She looked directly at her husband until the smoke swallowed her face. When it was over, a gust of wind scattered the ashes toward the river. The crowd gasped. They said her hair still glowed red as it vanished into the sky. 2 years later, Don Alvaro was found dead in his home. They said it was fever, but his servants whispered that every night before his death, he saw her in the corner of the room, standing, silent, her dress of smoke. Catalina's trial records were buried, labeled "Case Closed." But her story spread in secret, told by women in kitchens, by mothers to daughters. They called her not witch, but martyr. And for decades, when a woman was accused, she would whisper before the flames, "Remember Catalina." Because the Inquisition had built a system that turned love into a weapon. Husbands betrayed wives. Priests betrayed faith. Neighbors betrayed neighbors. All for a taste of safety, for the illusion of virtue. And every betrayal fed the fire that still burns in history's memory. After Catalina's ashes cooled, a strange quiet settled over Spain. The crowds went home. The inquisitors wrote their reports. The husbands who had testified returned to their beds and slept soundly for the first time in months. But the women did not sleep. Something changed in them. It wasn't surrender. It was survival. They began to speak softer, to hide their books, to pray in whispers, to teach their daughters not what to say, but what not to say. A generation of women learned that safety meant invisibility. By the mid-1500s, silence had become a form of armor. In villages across Castile, women still practiced healing, still delivered babies, still brewed medicines, but they no longer called it knowledge. They called it luck, or God's mercy. They hid herbs in bread baskets, holy water in wine bottles, amulets behind crucifixes. Every gesture, every secret became part of a language that only they understood, a language built to survive men's faith. One of the few documents that describes this secret world is the diary of Maria de la Cruz, a convent scribe from Toledo, written in 1562. The Inquisition never found it. Her entries are simple, almost timid, but between the lines, you can feel the terror of her age. Sister Leonor has burned her herbs. Sister Inez buries her books behind the chapel. We no longer pray aloud after sunset. The walls listen. Last week, a man came asking for names. We gave him bread. Bread keeps mouths busy. They say silence is obedience. I say silence is the only thing that keeps us alive. The convents became both prisons and shelters. Many of the women who entered them were not seeking God. They were hiding from the world. Inside the stone walls, they copied manuscripts, taught each other to read in secret, and wrote letters they would never send. Their ink became their rebellion. Their quiet became their defense. But silence is a dangerous thing. It doesn't kill the truth. It preserves it. And when the truth has been preserved long enough, it begins to rot into rage. France, 1610. A young midwife named Geneviève Laurent fled from Spain after her mistress was accused of witchcraft. She settled in Lyon, blending in, pretending to be a widow. For years, she lived quietly, delivering babies, blessing homes. But rumors followed like smoke. Her skill was too precise. Her cures worked too quickly. When a noblewoman died during childbirth, her husband blamed the midwife. "Witch," he spat. The word was small, but it spread faster than disease. Geneviève was taken to the dungeon beneath the Palais de Justice. There was no trial, no Latin, no theology, only fists and questions shouted through the dark. Who taught you? Where did you learn these herbs? Do you renounce the devil? She stayed silent. 3 days later, they released her body to the river Rhône. Silence had protected women for a century. Now it began to betray them, because silence does not stop violence, it only hides it. And hiding, the Inquisition grew stronger. By the 1600s, its reach was everywhere. From Lisbon to Lima, from Naples to Mexico City, every whisper could become an accusation. Every act of care could become a crime. And the most dangerous words a woman could speak were still the ones Joan of Arc had dared to say 2 centuries earlier. God speaks to me. But for every woman burned, 10 others learned to disappear. They learned to mask their strength as meekness, their wisdom as ignorance, their courage as prayer. They became ghosts in their own lives, surviving not by fighting the system, but by vanishing within it. They stitched their defiance into the hems of dresses. They sang forbidden hymns as lullabies. They baptized their daughters in secret, whispering, "Remember, but never repeat." They turned silence into memory, and memory into power. When you read the Inquisition records today, the most haunting thing is not the cruelty, it's the gaps, the missing names, the erased confessions, the lines scratched out with black ink by trembling hands. Those absences are not emptiness. They are proof. Proof of how many voices refused to die even when they could no longer speak. The Inquisition wanted to erase women from history. Instead, it forced them to master the art of surviving it. And in the end, that silence, patient, invisible, generational, became the one thing no fire could destroy. By the late 18th century, Europe was changing. The age of reason had arrived, or so the philosophers said. Men spoke of liberty, science, and progress. They invented telescopes to see the stars, microscopes to study life, and laws to replace superstition. But in the quiet valleys of the Swiss Alps, the smoke of one last pyre still rose against the sky. Her name was Anna Goldy, and in 1782 she became the final woman in Europe to be executed for witchcraft. Almost 400 years after Joan of Arc, the flames burned again. Glarus, Switzerland, a small, devout Protestant town hemmed in by mountains. The people there believed they had left the darkness of the Middle Ages behind. They had courts, newspapers, and schools. But the shadow of the old faith still lingered, the belief that evil could wear the face of a woman. Anna was 48. She worked as a servant in the house of a wealthy physician, Dr. Jakob Tschudi. He was respected, powerful, and, as gossip whispered, drawn to her. She had come from poverty. She had buried a child. She knew hunger, humiliation, and the fragile safety of a woman living under another's roof. When a young girl in the household, Tschuti's own daughter, fell mysteriously ill, the doctor's wife began to whisper. The child vomited pins. Her limbs twisted in fever. No remedy worked. And in the fearful silence that followed, someone had to be blamed. They said Anna had bewitched the child, They said she had baked bread with hidden nails. They said she had a secret pact with Satan, sealed with the doctor's blood. It didn't matter that the doctor himself had dismissed her weeks earlier, after rumors of their affair spread through town. It didn't matter that there was no proof, only fear, sharpened by scandal. On February 6, 1782, Anna was arrested. The trial was not held by the church this time, but by civil judges who still thought like inquisitors. They avoided the word witchcraft, calling it instead poisoning. It was a legal trick, a way to hang a woman without admitting that superstition still ruled their hearts. They tortured her in secret, stretching her on the rack until her shoulders cracked. They demanded she confess to consorting with the devil. After days of agony, she broke. She said the words they wanted, that she had signed a pact, that she had cursed the child. It was all they needed. On June 13, 1782, Anna Goldie was led to the execution ground outside Glarus. The sun was hot, the crowd quiet. She wore a plain white dress, her wrists bound with iron. The judge read the sentence: "Death by sword, not fire, a modern mercy." But as the blade fell, witnesses swore they smelled smoke. Some said it was the forge used to sharpen the weapon. Others said it was the devil leaving her body. But maybe, just maybe, it was history itself, burning one last time. Her body was buried in unmarked ground. Her name was erased from the town records. And yet, within weeks, pamphlets appeared across Switzerland, calling her trial a disgrace. One anonymous writer asked, "How can we claim to be enlightened if we still kill women for invisible crimes?" For the first time, the execution of a witch was met not with fear, but with outrage. The world had finally begun to wake. The Enlightenment did not end darkness overnight. But Anna's death marked a line in history, a final ember in the centuries-long fire that had devoured tens of thousands. In 2008, more than 200 years later, the Swiss government officially exonerated her. They called her what she truly was, the victim of a judicial murder. The Inquisition never truly disappeared. It simply changed its form. It moved from altars to courtrooms, from pyres to prisons, from heresy to ideology. But every time power fears truth, or women, the fire flickers again. Joan, Catalina, Genevieve, Anna, different names, same smoke. Their stories are not just warnings, they are mirrors. Because even today, when a woman is silenced, dismissed, or destroyed for defying her place, the echo of those flames still lingers in the air. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it. The crackle of burning wood, the whisper of a prayer swallowed by smoke, and the voice that once said, "I am not afraid, for God is with me." This is not just history. It's the story of what happens when faith forgets mercy, when power demands purity, and when silence becomes survival. This is the last fire of the Inquisition, and the women who refused to vanish in its light.